Mormon and non-Mormon Egyptologists agree that the characters on the fragments do not match the translation given in the Book of Abraham. I wanted to have one topic where I went all the way down, where I wasn't taking anyone else's word for it. I went to the source and figured it out. They believed 100% that this was true revelation. Yeah, so we'll be talking about the Book of Abraham and the whole translation process. Just a brief introduction to what the Book of Abraham is. It is a canonized scripture of the mainstream LDS Church, and it was translated by Joseph Smith from some Egyptian papyri starting in 1835 in Kirtland, Ohio. So this papyrus that he translated was later sold to a museum and was thought to be lost until 1967, until it was returned, and then it was returned to the church. So now that we have all the translation documents, we have the papyrus, we can kind of see, did Joseph's prophetic ability allow him to translate before the Egyptian code was cracked with the Rosetta Stone? So just a brief comparison to the Book of Mormon, which I'm sure many are familiar with. How did Joseph Smith view this in relation to an ancient text? So just a really interesting comparison here, that they were both written by the hand of a ancient prophet upon plates or on papyrus. They were translated by Joseph Smith. So by all accounts of how it's the introduction of the title page of these texts, it purports to be a genuine ancient text, same as the Book of Mormon. So an overview of the timeline here. The actual Egyptian artifacts were purchased in July of 1835. And then between this period of July and November in 1835, that's where kind of the bulk of the work happened of the translation. And then there was kind of a gap. And then it wasn't until 1842 when these actually started being published as articles in the Times and Seasons. So there's a total of 3 articles that comprise the scripture that's in your quad today. Those were then eventually published as a pamphlet in 1851. The Egyptian artifacts actually stayed in Nauvoo with the Smith family, and then they were sold to a museum in 1856. And they were believed to have been destroyed in the Great Chicago Fire, but that ended up not being the case. It wasn't until 1880 when this was actually formally canonized by the mainstream LDS Church. And then all the way in 1967, that's when these artifacts were discovered in a different museum. They weren't in the Chicago Fire. They were returned to the church. A lot of analysis has been done on them since then. But it wasn't until 2013 when the church actually published an essay addressing the translation and historicity of this document. So the main stuff we're going to focus on is very early in the beginning of how Joseph Smith was working with the scribes and translating this. So what were these artifacts? So there was a traveling salesman museum type thing that they bought these artifacts from, and it comprised of 4 mummies, actual real mummies. There was 2 main scrolls, one that was identified as the Book of Abraham. A second one was identified as the Book of Joseph. There was another fragment that was later identified as facsimile 2, the round one. And there was several other scraps and fragments in the collection. So our best kind of construction of what happened actually comes from the Joseph Smith history volume. And so I'm going to read these because I think it's good to hear kind of what Joseph Smith would have said. So 3rd July 1835, Michael H. Chandler came to Kirtland to exhibit some Egyptian mummies. together with some 2 or more rolls of papyrus covered in hieroglyphic figures and devices. He brought me some of the characters and I gave the interpretation. Then 3 days later, soon after this, some of the saints at Kirtland purchased the mummies and papyrus, a description of which will appear hereafter, and I, with William W. Phelps and Oliver Cowdery as scribes, commenced the translation of some of the characters, or hieroglyphics, and much to our joy, found that one of the rolls contained the writings of Abraham, the other the writings of Joseph of Egypt. And then there's one entry here that covers the whole month of July. It says, the remainder of this month I was continually engaged in translating an alphabet to the Book of Abraham and arranging a grammar of the Egyptian language as practiced by the ancients. So, these would have been either written by Joseph Smith or approved by him in the official history of the church. So really fascinating stuff, but they started translating some things right away, but very soon started work on this grammar and alphabet, which we'll definitely be getting into. So then some more context from Joseph Smith's own journal that go all the way up through November. So I won't read all of these, but it's talking about the Egyptian alphabet, unfolding the system of astronomy, translating the ancient records, spent the day in translating. So this is when we believe the bulk of the translation was actually done, was in November. But 26th November is kind of the last day that we have evidence that they were working on this all the way up until February of 1842. Okay, so he mentioned a grammar and alphabet, mentions a translation, so we would expect to find some documents that they were working on, and indeed these are preserved. So there's kind of 4 main categories of documents. There's the Valuable Discovery Notebook, which is kind of like several papers and a notebook of transcribed characters, copying of the drawings on the papyrus, and there is one translation on there that is important. Then there's these 3 sets of alphabets, each in the handwriting. One is in the handwriting of Joseph, one's in the handwriting of Oliver Cowdery, and the other is W.W. Phelps. And then it seemed like the work on those alphabets was kind of flowed into the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language, which is like kind of it's a bound book that's much more organized and kind of lays out rules and explanations of the Egyptian language. So we'll be referring to that as the Gale going forward. And then there's the actual manuscripts themselves, which have the original dictated text of the Book of Abraham that now appears in the scriptures. So just to give you some visuals of what some of these things look like, the Valuable Discovery Notebook, copies of characters, copies of some of the pictures, and then there's a translation that we'll look at later. The Egyptian alphabets, all 3 are very close together. It seemed like they were all kind of working in tandem just to have extra copies, one would presume. But the one we're looking at here is in Joseph Smith's handwriting. So it's in the left column there, there's characters, and then in the right column, there's a sound. And then following that, there's an explanation of what it means. So we'll kind of look at where a lot of this stuff comes from later. And then here's a kind of a snapshot of the Gale. Some interesting concepts here is the character dissection. So there's kind of a lecture in here that describes how each component of the character has a meaning, and when you add them together, it adds to the meaning, or kind of you can kind of mix and match and create different increased meanings by combining the characters. And then there's the character degrees, where as you add lines above or below the characters, it increases the significance. So, for example, this character has 5 components. It's got a dot, 2 dots, a vertical line, a slanted line, and a horizontal line. So that would be 5 parts of speech, they call it. And then as you add a line over it, it multiplies it by 5. So that'd be 25 parts of speech and so on. So this will be important as we later see that each character can make up like a paragraph of text. And they explain it all, or Joseph presumably explains it all here in the Gale, what he thought was going on with the language. So then the manuscripts themselves have a left margin with characters. In fact, in this one, this is a zoomed in version of manuscript C. Although the page has been cut off, it used to say character. And then over here in the main body of the text, it says translation of the Book of Abraham by his own, written on papyrus by his own hand. So this, if you were to read this and, get out your quad and compare it, it'd be very close. There was, grammar corrections, little tweaks during the printing, but this is essentially the Book of Abraham. There's 3 different manuscripts, and we'll get into why that's the case and why it's important. Okay, so how do all these things relate to each other? This graphic here is my effort to explain it the best I can. It's not perfect, but hopefully it'll give you a general idea of kind of how things flowed together. So all the way over on the left, early July, that's when a lot of the work in the valuable discovery would have been done. And then just the first 3 verses of the Book of Abraham would have been translated at that point. Then we see some of the ideas in those documents being used in the alphabets, and even more things being pulled in from the papyri, from other ideas of Joseph Smith in the alphabets. Then the same content that's in the alphabets was then formalized and better organized into the grammar and alphabet, and it was expanded upon. And then we see a lot of that content or ideas, storylines, story concepts were then used in the actual Book of Abraham, but it's not like a direct one-to-one link, like they translated each character and then directly used the grammar and alphabet to translate it. It's more of like Joseph Smith was expounding on his ideas, hunting for a story, if you will, and then drew upon those concepts while dictating the Book of Abraham. And then a really important thing here is manuscript A and B are simultaneously dictated starting in verse 4. And then what was dictated there was then copied into the notebook, and then all the way from chapter 2, verse 7 through 18 was then dictated into that book. And that's what comprised the first Articles and Times, Times and Seasons publication in 1842. And then there was 2 more publications that comprise of the rest of the Book of Abraham. Those seem to have been done in tandem with the publications in 1842. Okay, so just one note here on how we know that manuscript A and B were dictated simultaneously. There's just one example shown here, but there's many. There's identical emendations to the text that are consistent with someone starting to form a sentence, but then realizing they need to reformulate how the sentence is structured. So if you were to read this, how it might have originally been, it would have said, I sought for the appointment whereunto, but then, okay, wait, I need to rephrase that. I sought for mine appointment unto the priesthood. So, and then you see here, it says sought for the, and then the is scratched out, and mine. Same ink, exact same emendation in the other manuscript. So it's these types of textual evidence that tell us that these were live dictated and they were done simultaneously because they all have the same corrections. And then when these were copied into manuscript C, this error is not copied as you would expect. So one really important thing about that is I believe it was manuscript B, yeah, was done by Warren Parrish. And he didn't become a scribe of Joseph Smith until 29 of October, 1835. So that kind of forces the timeline out to that time where, you know, a lot of faithful interpretations would want the full translation to be done back in July, but this kind of is direct evidence against that. So one interesting thing we can do is try to identify, well, where did they get these characters? You know, now that we have the papyrus from the museum, we can go looking for this. So interestingly enough, in the Valuable Discovery Notebook, the characters that are transcribed there come from an actual missing scroll, which would have been the Book of the Dead for Amenhotep. So it's transcribed well enough to where Egyptologists can read it and identify it. Some of the other drawings we can find in papyrus that was returned to the church. So here's a pretty interesting one where you've got the snake and the person with the staff. I like to think that they thought that this was Satan the serpent and Eve or something, but I can't remember where I heard that, but funny to think about. Then the one translation that does appear in the Valuable Discovery Notebook talks about this Princess Ketumen, who was the daughter of Onitis, king of Egypt, who began to reign in the year of the world 2962. So what's really interesting about this is this was essentially Joseph Smith attempting to identify who the mummies were. And so later on, when these mummies were put in, basically you could pay to go and view these artifacts in Nauvoo. And Lucy Smith would identify the mummies to the visitors as Princess Ketumen, King Onitis. Another interesting tidbit is on the back of one of the pages of the Valuable Discovery Notebook, you can see the arithmetic, the longhand arithmetic of them figuring out these years. And so what's significant about this is the character does appear in the alphabet, so it's kind of carried forward. And it seemed like there was confusion about how to draw it exactly, which is just really fascinating. But we can kind of tell the order from that as that character evolved. Okay, so onto the alphabets. Where did they get these characters? So just, I guess, first a brief description, and here's some text that you can actually read of some of the sounds and explanations. But the way these are organized is there's 5 parts, which is basically sections. And the total characters on these pages is 138, but only 69 of those were given a sound, and even less of those were given a complete explanation. So it kind of started out, you know, the first page is completely filled out, the next page a little bit less, the next page a little bit less. So it's kind of like it started out as a grand vision, but then kind of petered out and then moved into the Gale. So this first section of, well, so out of the 5 parts, all the characters, we can figure out where most of them came from. The first part is actually the least clear because what seemed like they were doing is grabbing from various papyrus and dissecting the characters and organizing them by shape. And we'll see that on the next slide. The second part, comes from the pure Adamic language, which is a whole nother story. We'll cover that. Then after the pure Adamic language, still in the second part, they start a sequential copying of these characters that surround facsimile 1. They kind of just go down the column. And there's a couple really interesting characters here. But here in column 3 is the origin of Kolob, which we'll show later. So, like I was mentioning, part 1, there's kind of these, a lot of these aren't actually Egyptian characters, but you can see where some of them might have come from. A lot of these were taken, kind of dissected, like we saw in the grammar lecture. Like this character down here, each component was kind of broken apart. So definitely some interesting stuff going on here with part 1. In part 2, we have the pure language. So this is something Joseph was talking about as early as 1832. This idea that there was a pure language before the Tower of Babel that Adam would have spoke. But so in 1832, there's a document that Joseph Smith it dictated that talks about these definitions of, what is the name of God? Amen. What is the Son of God? Son, Amen. Kind of in this question and answer format. But the reason we know about the characters is a letter from W.W. Phelps in May of 1835, which was 1 month prior to them acquiring the artifacts. At the time he was working as a scribe, he was actually living with Joseph Smith. But in his letter, he gives a sample of the pure language, or a specimen of the pure language. And you can see those exact characters find themselves in part 2 of the alphabet. And these are carried forward into the Gael as well. It's interesting that the definitions in alphabets don't match exactly, but it's a very similar content, Son of God, angels, those types of things. Okay, we won't cover all of these in the rest of the alphabets, but here's just one example of how the characters were written onto the papyrus. Some characters are copied better than others, but you can kind of get, you can see the interpretation there. Okay, so some more on the Gael. So all of the alphabet content was basically carried forward into the Gael, but for whatever reason, they decided to organize it a little differently. So if you look at the green here, all the way down at the end of the alphabets, there was 2 characters that received a sound, but no definition. Those find themselves in the very beginning of the Gael, and they're expounded in 5 degrees of meaning. Then the next 2 characters in the Gael actually come from part 3 of the alphabet, and those were the only 2 characters that received a sound in that part. So it's kind of like the end of the alphabets kind of flows into the beginning of the Gael. And then you have the entirety of part 1 is brought over to the rest of the Gael part 1. And each of these is given 5 different degrees of meaning. And we'll see some examples of what that is exactly. And then for part 2 of the Gael, that all comes from part 2 of the alphabets. But for whatever reason, they don't each get all 5 degrees. It's kind of this stair-stepped approach. So maybe maybe Joseph was getting tired of making up 5 degrees for everything. So that continues all the way through to the end. But then here at the very end, this last group of characters get expounded all the way out. And what's significant about these is these are the names of planets and solar systems and that type of thing. There's Kolob at the very end. These all kind of the ideas that are expounded here appear in the description of facsimile 2, which we'll see near the end. So just an example of, okay, what's going on with these degrees. So this first character here, Abraham, which is supposed to mean Abraham, right? But you you can kind of see there's a general tending towards a more fundamental idea towards the first degree and something more detailed in the fifth degree. It doesn't always seem to follow like that. And it's not really completely explained like exactly how this system works. But you know, it's a lot of them are kind of forced extrapolations where you kind of get the feeling that someone's just trying to fill the space. Um, but a lot of the ideas here are used in the actual manuscript translation. Okay, so now on to the actual manuscripts of the Book of Abraham. So we can actually look to the context of the text itself to discover where it should be located. So in Abraham 1, verse 12, it says, you know, the priest laid violence upon me, that you may have knowledge of this altar. I will refer you to the representation at the commencement of this record. So this is obviously referring to facsimile 1. It's referred to in another verse, but it's a bit redundant. So since Egyptian is read from right to left, we would expect to find the facsimile 1 all the way on the right of whatever scroll this came from. And if you can just imagine, let's just imagine for a minute that there really was an Abraham and he really was penning down these characters. If he wrote these words, you know, he would be sitting there with his roll and have the representation at the commencement of the record. So, you know, the idea that the facsimile is just completely disjointed from the text, I don't think really makes much sense. And in fact, what we find is that the characters in the margins of the manuscripts are here in this blue box, right where you would expect. So, you know, all the characters are kind of accounted for in red. Those are all in the alphabet. And then things kind of move over to this first piece of papyrus. So in the next slides, we'll be showing these characters a little closer, but just take note of the red numbers. They're sequentially numbered through the pages of the manuscript. So here's a zoomed in of where the first characters would have started from. So obviously there's a damaged portion here, but as soon as the papyrus is not damaged, we see a pretty good transcribing of the characters one for one. And so that's very interesting. Well, what's very interesting is these characters in this damaged portion, they tend to look a little different. And they may look familiar if you were paying attention. We'll see some potential sources of these from the earlier documents. Another thing that's important to note is characters 1 and 2. From a parallel text of a similar type of papyrus, a parallel text essentially, we do find these two characters at the start of that text. So it indicates to me that this piece was not damaged at the time that they had it, and that they could make out that those characters are supposed to go there. But maybe later on, the rest of it flaked off. But as soon as we get to character 3, 4, 5, 6, these are actually not recognizable as Egyptian. Same with 13, 14, 15, and 16. So we do have, and it continues on for 3 rows, and then the last row just has 1 character. But it is sequential all the way through in the manuscripts from 1835. So we have this quote here from Lucy Smith. Uh, when Joseph was reading the papyrus, he closed his eyes and held a hat over his face, and that the revelation came to him, and that where the papyrus was torn, he could read the parts that were destroyed equally well as those that were there. So um, President Nelson here is giving us an excellent demonstration of how that might have looked. So definitely there's an idea here that Joseph Smith was restoring what originally should have been there. Okay, so how does this match up with, or how does this relate to the earlier documents we were talking about, the Gale and the alphabets? So right off the bat, we can look over here on the left. We've got these 3 characters that show up in the beginning of the Gale, which just so happen to be the first 3 characters in the manuscript. Another interesting tidbit is these first 2 characters are actually keyed to text. So you can see this 1 here, 2 to Abraham right there. So for whatever reason, that didn't continue. I suspect that it was too arduous to try to match up everything. And what's really interesting is that these first 3 characters have the best correlation to the text, but then it soon becomes kind of its own thing that starts to evolve and is not really directly drawing on specific things in the Gale, but you can definitely tell there's a connection to some of the ideas. So just as a more complete example here, character 1, up there at the top is verse 1, and it's color-coded here to different explanations of this character from the Gale part 1. So you can see there's a lot of content here, a lot of different explanations for the same thing. A lot of it doesn't appear in the verse, but you can definitely tell where key concepts and phrases are being used and morphed together to form complete thoughts. A similar example here with the character 2. Very similar explanations. This one, instead of having just 1 degree explained, it basically uses all the phrases from each degree. Very similar thing here with character 3. What's interesting about this one is it's kind of it's a very choppy, almost as if someone was just trying to fit together existing phrases that they already had, rather than just kind of dictating a flowing sentence. So definitely the first 3 verses are the most interesting. And then very soon after that, it becomes much more free-flowing. And we don't find character 5 and 6 don't actually, there's not a 1-for-1 match in the alphabets or grammar. But going along with the idea that you can combine characters, you can draw them in different ways. you can see where a lot of these same shapes, right, are kind of being put together. And again, these are not actual Egyptian characters. So um, the idea that they would have been originally would have been right next to real Egyptian characters is not really a tenable position. There are some other, I won't go through all of them, but there's some other examples where, this character, one of my favorites, Iota Tau Estip Xi, just rolls all right off the tongue. But some of the ideas in this character are used in verse 23, but you can see they've added more to the character, but you can definitely tell where it came from, right? It's kind of got that swoosh and then the dot in the middle. So there's little tidbits like that, but for the actual real Egyptian characters, there's some of the ideas, some concepts like priests and virgins and King Pharaoh, right? All these ideas appear in the Gale and the alphabets. But since these were actual characters that were already there, they didn't have to invent them, and then could just free flow the story from there. So I guess the big reveal, are all these translations correct? So we'll use the official church source for this. This was the Translation and Historicity of the Book of Abraham essay. These are approved by the First Presidency. It says that in the introduction to all the essays. This one covers this topic. It does do its best to maintain a faithful interpretation of each part of the data, but it does make several critical admissions that once you know all this data, most of the apologetics just fall flat. So here's one quote here. Neither the rules nor the translations in the grammar book correspond to those recognized by Egyptologists today. And just a reminder that in Joseph Smith history, he's talking about himself working on this grammar and alphabet. Another quote here, none of the characters on the papyrus fragments mentioned Abraham's name or any of the events in the Book of Abraham. Mormon and non-Mormon Egyptologists agree that the characters on the fragments do not match the translation given in the Book of Abraham. Scholars have identified the papyrus fragments as parts of standard funerary texts that were deposited with mummified bodies. These fragments date between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE, long after Abraham lived. So, and just a reminder that it does claim in the title page of the Book of Abraham that these ancient records that had fallen into their hands did contain the writings of Abraham written by his own hand. So, long after Abraham lived, definitely didn't have anything to do with Abraham, as admitted by this essay. So what is this scroll actually? It is what's known as a breathing permit or a book of breathing. This very particular one would have been for someone named Hor, and it's a funerary text that you bury with the mummy. And it basically gives the story of what's going to happen to you after you die. You get reanimated, how your body should be prepared, and then how you will be judged. Here on the left, that's what facsimile 3 is showing, kind of the deceased here being presented before the god Osiris to be judged and hopefully be deemed just. So this is a text that would have been very common, kind of almost standardized, but obviously things change over the years. But there's many examples of these types of books of breathings. So here's one example that's in Lafayette College. Kind of a similar idea where there's a picture in the beginning, then there's the judgment scene at the end. Um, there's whoever the scribe was for this particular one may have decided to depict a different scene, or in the judgment scene, right there, there's a story that goes along with this. So you can kind of take creative liberty with which characters you're going to draw, how you're going to draw it. But I mean, the story is there. It's not, you can't just interpret it any way you want. Okay, so Joseph also gave explanations to these facsimiles. And so we have some other journal entries where he's describing having gone and worked with R. Hadlock, who was making the lead plates that would become, the printer's version of the facsimile. So, he's giving instructions concerning this cut. And then there's another journal entry where he's, proofreading the Times and Seasons as editor for the first time. So everything in here he would have had been proofreading and claiming credit for, basically. So really interesting here where there's the you can see the piece of paper that it was glued to. It's penciled in what Joseph Smith thought should be there. And then here's the canonized version. So just interesting to notice that the whole knife over the shoulder didn't quite work out, it seems. So the figure there just, I guess, does not have a left arm. But now that we know, okay, this is a breathing permit, we know the story, we know what should be there. It should be this jackal-headed figure, who is a god called Anubis. And this is the character in Egyptian religion who embalms you, prepares your body, and also reanimates you, and gets you ready to be judged. So yeah, very well-known character in Egyptian religion. I mean, we call it mythology now, but it was their religion, right? So here's another interpretation of what should have been there. It can be drawn several different ways, but it's always Anubis, and people are not being sacrificed on this sacred kind of briar or couch that you would lay important deceased people. Some other examples, it's on the walls of temples, it's on papyrus, it's a very well-known thing. Here's another very interesting one. This here on the right is in the Chapel of Osiris, which is thought to be a very sacred representation where the deceased has the hand to the face, as rubbing their eyes as they're being reanimated, awoken. Their legs are separated, indicating that they're starting to move. And actually this bird here would represent the god Isis, which in this case would be the wife of the god Osiris, and he's actually impregnating her there. So lots of ideas around fertility and posterity and things like that. So yeah, very well known scene. Won't go over all of these, but they're here in the slides. But basically, Joseph Smith's interpretations on the left, modern Egyptological interpretation on the right, and you can just kind of compare. No really good matches here. So just kind of summary of facsimile 1, putting a knife in Anubis's hand and giving him a different head would be kind of like having Captain Moroni burying a treasure chest. Maybe in 1,000 years, someone could see this picture and say, yeah, that's a valid interpretation of that picture. But if you know the story, you know the characters, it's just incorrect, right? Okay, on to facsimile 2. So another journal entry here where we can kind of identify where, again, he was working with Brother R. Hadlock to make, well, he brought the Book of Abraham in the original to Brother R. Hadlock so that he might take the size of several plates. And he also gave instruction concerning the arrangement of the writing on the large cut, illustrating the principles of astronomy. So this is the one that talks about Kolob, God sitting on his throne, and there's some connections here with the gale, the very end of the gale. So one really interesting thing about this is we actually don't have the original, but what we do have is this hand copy that was made. But you'll notice it's incomplete. And if you look closely, you can see in the pencil marks here where it's kind of scribbled, almost indicating that, hey, the original was damaged here, so that's all we could copy. But obviously in the canonized version, it is complete. So everything here in red is what's missing from the original copy. So we can try to figure out, okay, were they actually, was Joseph Smith actually restoring this image correctly? And where did this stuff come from? So first we'll just identify where the stuff came from. So this one, this little boat here comes from one of the scrolls that we did recover, and Joseph identified it as the Book of Joseph. But we now know that this is the Book of the Dead for Semminus. This has got to be one of my favorites, the head here in blue. That's kind of copied down and offset from that body down there. Not sure what they were thinking there. But another fun one is this little table here, which is a symbol in Egyptian religion where you put offerings. So called a libation table. But you'll notice it appears in facsimile 1 in the bottom right corner. So likely copied from there. Okay, then we have the actual Egyptian characters. So what's really interesting about these is they do come from this piece of the papyrus where the manuscript characters come from. But what looks like what happened is it was taken, that whole row was taken, rotated 180 degrees, and then those little 3 groupings were put in those rows. So just some copy and paste, right? And now if you could imagine this was actually English, right? It would just be like someone copying, pasting sentences that don't have anything to do with each other. So really, really interesting. The same thing happens around the perimeter, except this time there was a character actually used that does appear on the manuscripts, but it was also copied onto the perimeter here, and twice for some reason. And then the same thing with the rest here around the edge. And they were kind of rotated sideways and drawn backwards, of course. But yeah, so a lot of copying pasting going on with this one. So, okay, what should facsimile 2 actually be? This is what's known as a hypocephalus. So this would be a disc-shaped thing that is put underneath the mummy's head and is just, another part of the funerary ritual. So all this stuff on here has meaning that goes along with it. So there's actually a very similar one. I mean, these are somewhat standardized, but obviously they're each a little different. So we can kind of compare this to get a better idea of maybe what should have been there in those red parts. So first of all, for the boat, I mean, he at least got it right that it was a boat. So props there, but not the right interpretation of what should have been there. Terms of the little libation table from facsimile 1, likely should have been some other characters. And then this head that was copied from the first section, yeah, should have been this like 4 heads of a ram or something. But at least it's, on the center of the body. Something else that's really interesting is, I mean, I can't read Egyptian, but just looking at this, you see the man here, you see this, little box. It's not a one-for-one exact text, but you can see it's probably saying something very similar with these different characters here. But you'll notice as soon as you come to this red line, right, that's when all similarities stop, and these are actually just completely different type of character. It's kind of like if someone switched from typewriter text to longhand cursive and wanted you to believe that it was the same type of text. It would just be totally different, right, to someone who could actually read it. What's really interesting in the explanations of this facsimile, they're labeled as figure 1, figure 2, and so on. So this is where we see Kolob appearing, right? And it's the last character in the grammar. And that's what it looks like. That's Kolob. So after singing about it all those years, we finally get to see how to draw it. So yeah, a lot of these ideas of astronomy are basically the same ideas that are developed here in the Gale. I won't go through all these again, but yeah, none of this really matches Joseph Smith's explanation. Okay, last one, facsimile 3. So this is the judgment scene, and we actually don't have the original of this. It was probably separated and lost. Maybe it will turn up one day, but this scene we know should be at the end of the Book of Breathings. It's kind of like the ending of the story, where you're welcomed into God's presence and you're just and everything's good. So we have examples of what this should have looked like. Here's a very similar example. This was in Robert Rittner's Mormon Stories interview. I kind of stuck them together so we can see the whole image. But a lot of the same concepts are here, where you have the deceased individual being led by Anubis through the afterlife to be judged. Here's that person's offerings. Here's the scribe that's going to keep record. So, all these have symbolic meaning in Egyptian religion. So obviously the big one here is that Anubis got his snout cut off and one of his ears cut off. So there's actually, if you zoom into the original printing plate, you can see these different tool marks here where Anubis's snout should have been. And maybe the ear was originally there. There's kind of this little divot here. But it seems very likely that the snout was originally there and then someone directed that it be taken off. My bet's Joseph Smith, right? But yeah, so I remember years opening up my scriptures board in sacrament meeting, looking at this character, just trying to figure out what is this guy with the little spike on his head. So it's nice to finally know what it should have been. Okay, so last one here is, this is one of the places that I like the most, where it's so direct that you can't weasel out of it in any way. So let's figure 2 here in blue, King Pharaoh, whose name is given in the characters above his head. So number 2, characters above his head. we would expect this to say King Pharaoh, but it actually does not. It's saying this is Isis, the mother of God, or something like that. But this is the god Isis, which is a female, as we can see by the long hair here. So not sure why Joseph would have said this was King Pharaoh. But, so there's a couple other instances of that in this in these explanations where it's directly linking these explanations to what the characters should say, but they don't say that. And then just here for the record, every interpretation kind of mapped out. None of them really match up. Okay, so conclusions. I mean, we know Joseph Smith himself was claiming to be translating Egyptian records, arranging a grammar. You know, the church admits that these documents do not match the translation. Joseph Smith claimed that the breathing permit of Hor was about Abraham, but it's the breathing permit of Horus. In the areas where there's damaged characters, the characters that appear like they should be there are not Egyptian, and you know they're not the characters that actually should be there. Pretty much all the interpretations of the facsimiles are incorrect. I think the deliberate change to the snout of Anubis indicates that, you know, there was an conscious deception, not just merely self-delusion, maybe. So just some thoughts, right? How, let's say this really was scripture. How could this come from such a mistaken source? Like, would that even make sense? Why would God author such confusion? And what does this say about claims to have translated other ancient documents? You know, reformed Egyptian shows up again on the gold plates, but let's just imagine for a moment that the idea was that this was just the catalyst theory and Joseph Smith was receiving true revelation, but he thought he was translating, but actually it was just real revelation through the hat or whatever. By that same logic, you know, the gold plates could say something totally different if they existed, right? And it wouldn't actually match, it might not actually match the Book of Mormon. So that would be a fascinating thing, right? To try to reason out. But yeah, so that is the presentation. There's some links here at the end. I think we'll be making the slides available for those that want them. So that's some of my sources where I got most of my information and material from. And that's it. I guess last thing I just want to say big thanks to my wife for helping me with this and helping me have the time to do all this. So yeah, that's it.